Welcome to the Nebraska Department of Education's Professional Learning Module, Supporting English Learners in Math Lessons. I'm Brooke David, Title III Assistant Director at the Nebraska Department of Education. This webinar will take approximately 45 minutes. However, throughout the video, there are places to pause and reflect so that is just an approximate length of time. This webinar accompanies the Math and ELP Standards Alignment resource documents developed as part of the Math and ELP Standards Alignment completed in December 2017. This webinar includes a viewing guide. Be sure to have that and any other materials necessary available before starting the webinar. If you have more questions about supporting or serving English learners after you participate in this webinar, please look for more resources and information on the Department's Title III website listed on the screen. Here's our umbrella question found in the viewing guide. How can classroom teachers support English learners at varying levels of English proficiency during math lessons? Today we will explore levels of English language proficiency and go through a process for determining supports for English learners in your classroom and lessons. In this webinar, you will explore the shift in English language proficiency, or ELP standards, connect student characteristics to levels of English language proficiency, examine supports for English learners at different levels of English language proficiency, and practice integrating math and ELP standards and add English learner supports into your lesson. In the viewing guide, you can find the materials that you will need to complete this webinar. If you need to gather materials, please stop the webinar now. If you can't get all the materials together, you can still go through the webinar without them. Please note, Nebraska is part of the ELPA 21 Assessment Consortium. The following information concerning ELP assessments and standards is adapted from the ELPA 21 Professional Development Learning Modules. If you're interested in more professional learning opportunities around the ELP standards, please visit elpa21.org. In 2015, the Nebraska State Board of Education approved Nebraska's College and Career Ready Standards in Mathematics. The new standards signal an upward shift in the knowledge, skills, and abilities students must develop to be college and career ready in the 21st century. And although content areas have always been linguistically demanding, the new standards make language demands and practices more evident. Take some time to reflect on these questions. Please pause the video for a moment to respond on page 4 of your viewing guide to these questions. If you are able, share with your colleagues. Press play when you are ready to resume. It is important that you have a general understanding of the Nebraska ELP standards as you think about supporting English learners in the general education classroom. The new Nebraska ELP standards follow the shift in content standards with an emphasis on analytical thinking, communicating, and applying knowledge, and are meant to guide both academic and language development. The standards were developed for all grade levels, K through 12, highlight the language necessary to engage in content-specific practices as well as vocabulary and grammar, and are meant to be used by both ELL teachers and content teachers. The ELP standards are not separate from content area learning, but instead are designed to complement and support that work. This graphic, found on page 5 of the viewing guide, demonstrates the difference between the previous versions of ELP standards and the new standards. First, while old standards promoted using simplified texts and activities, the new standards advocate for intellectually challenging activities that include language scaffolds to promote access to grade-level texts and deeper meaning. Second, researchers and practitioners' views on language development and the way ELLs are taught have shifted from seeing English as a set of rules with discrete skills that are the center of instruction toward an expanded view of language as a social process. Now, traditional grammatical terms such as noun, verb, clause are not ignored but are embedded as part of a meaningful, content-specific activities. And finally, the new ELP standards also reconceptualize the relationship between ELP and content standards. Previously, English language development and content learning were thought of as being sequential. English language proficiency was something that students had to demonstrate before digging into deep content learning. The new standards are not precursors, but are on equal footing with content standards. They were designed to correspond with college and career ready standards across all content areas to support ELL's academic language development and engagement in disciplinary learning. There are 10 core English language proficiency standards for all grade levels. These 10 core ELP standards are differentiated and broken down into progressions according to grade level bands. The 10 ELP standards shift the focus from what language does a student have to what is the student able to do with language within content areas. Standards 1 through 7 involve the language necessary for English learners to engage in content-specific practices associated with ELA and literacy, mathematics, and science. In other words, they focus on linguistic and analytical functions. They begin with a focus on extraction of meaning and then progress to engagement in the content-specific practices. Standards 8 through 10 demonstrate the language forms that are important to focus on, but only in the service of the other 7 standards. An essential feature of the new ELP standards is that the 10 core standards are applicable at every grade level. However, the standards are also organized by grade level bands, and within each grade level band, 5 different proficiency levels are detailed. Grade level bands include kindergarten, grade 1, 2 through 3, 4 through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12. Keep in mind that while the 10 core standards are the same at each grade level band, the 5 proficiency levels will be slightly different across grade level, according to the developmental capacities of the student at that grade level band. Take a look at the matrix showing the proficiency levels for Standards 1 in kindergarten. The standard listed on the left-hand side is the same as Standard 1 from the 10 core standards. An ELL can construct meaning from oral presentations and literary and informational text through grade-appropriate listening, reading, and viewing. Across the top of the matrix are the 5 proficiency levels for each standard, and each box below is a proficiency level descriptor, which describes what a student should be able to do by the end of each level for that standard. For instance, in kindergarten for Standard 1, students at level 1 should be able to, with prompting and support, use a very limited set of strategies to identify a few key words from read-alouds and oral presentations of information or stories. By level 5, however, they should be able to, with prompting and support, use a wide range of strategies to identify main topics, answer questions about key details, retell familiar stories from read-alouds, picture books, and oral presentations. Now that we have reviewed the ELP standards, reflect on the following questions. Please pause the video for a moment and think about your answers to these questions, which can be found in the viewing guide. If you are able, share with your colleagues. Press play when you are ready to resume. There is not one program model that a district must use to support English learners. Depending on the program model and the number of ELs in the district, students with varying levels of proficiency will be in the general education classroom. This is why it is important that the person in charge of the English language development, or ESL teacher, should work with the math teacher to help support English learners in the classroom. It is also important that the math teacher and/or classroom teacher understand the supports they might put in place to help support English learners in the classroom. ELs may need different types of supports in the general education classroom based on their level of English language proficiency. Even though the ELP standards show 5 levels of proficiency, districts may have different ways of determining levels for English learners. For the purpose of this webinar and for discussing proficiency and supports, we have collapsed levels 1 through 5 into 3 levels so that districts can use this model. The 3 levels of proficiency that we are going to use today are emerging, progressing, and nearly proficient. To clarify, the ELP standards include 5 levels of English language proficiency. To discuss supports, we've collapsed these levels into 3 categories that we call emerging or beginning students, progressing, intermediate students, and nearly proficient, students close to exiting EL status. To understand the 3 levels of English proficiency, the group will work together to complete a card sort to discuss the student characteristics of students at those 3 levels, emerging, progressing, and nearly proficient. The materials for the card sort can be found at the end of the viewing guide on page 15. At this time, please pause the video to complete the card sort. When you are finished, press play again to check your answers. Here are the typical student characteristics of English learners who would be considered emerging. These students will need the most support in the classroom. They are mostly newcomers and are just beginning to use familiar English structures and vocabulary. Often these students go through what is called a silent period, which means they are processing information but may not be producing much English yet. These students are still engaging and learning but aren't ready to produce much English yet. In time, they will begin to produce some words and sentences when they are ready to do so. Students who are considered progressing may be in this stage for a while depending on many factors, such as native language literacy level, age, and academic background. These students are probably becoming more proficient in social English but will still need more support in developing academic language skills. Students at the beginning of this level will still need a lot of support in the classroom, but as students advance to this level, some supports may be able to be taken away or changed to be more appropriate. Students who are nearly proficient are almost ready to exit the English Learner program. The level of service for these students will probably look quite different than those at other levels of proficiency. Often these students have one domain they need more support in, for example, reading. Nearly proficient students are often in general education classrooms and will need additional support from the classroom teacher, particularly in academic language. If you would like, pause the video again to check your answers. A complete chart of the proficiency level descriptions for English learners can be found on page 13 of the viewing guide. It's important to note that even though a student is considered proficient and has been exited from the English learner status, former English learners may still need support in the classroom. In order for a student to be considered proficient and no longer designated as an English learner, the student would have had to score all 4s or 5s on the annual summative English language proficiency assessment, the ELPA 21. Even though these students are no longer designated as English learners and are considered former English learners, they often need support accessing academic vocabulary and content-specific knowledge and skills, and it is completely appropriate for them to continue to have classroom supports. In fact, these students should be monitored for 4 years after they exit the English learner status. You may already know the level of English learners in your class. Use those levels to determine whether your students are emerging, progressing, or nearly proficient. Another option of determining the levels of your students is by asking for their ELPA 21 results from the program administrator in your district or building. The ELPA 21 is the annual summative assessment that English learners take each year. By looking at the scores in reading, writing, speaking, and listening, you should be able to determine a student's level. Here is a sample of an ELPA 21 individual student report. This sample score report can be found on page 8 of your viewing guide. Actual student reports may look slightly different, but will include the same information. In the sample on the screen and in the viewing guide, this 6th grade student has a score of 5 in listening, 3 in reading, 4 in speaking, and a 5 in writing. This student would be considered nearly proficient. The student has high scores in listening, speaking, and writing, but scored a 3 in reading, and therefore would not be determined proficient. However, since this student is very close to being proficient, we would consider this student nearly proficient. The proficiency status does not match the levels of proficiency that we discussed today. There is no nearly proficient status on the ELPA 21 score reports. Instead, these students would also be considered progressing. If you are unable to obtain assessment results again, look to the descriptions of the English language proficiency to best determine a general level for your students. Knowing the level of English learners in your class can help determine the types of supports you can provide during your math lessons. Today we will present parts of the Math ELP Alignment Resource document, including suggested supports for English learners during math activities, and the 3 levels of proficiency that we have discussed in this webinar. It is important to note that not all supports will be appropriate for every lesson and for every student. These are just suggestions. We also want to emphasize the supports are put into place to make the content more accessible for English learners, not to lower expectations. English learners come to the classroom with a wealth of knowledge and experiences. It is important to set high yet reasonable expectations of English learners while providing them with the more appropriate supports to access your lessons. This screen includes suggested supports for students at the emerging level. You can find this chart on page 9 of the viewing guide. The supports have been divided into 4 categories: supports for building vocabulary, scaffolds, supports to promote academic talk, and opportunities to demonstrate understanding. Students at this level will probably need the most supports for accessing grade level content. Pause the video now to look over these suggestions and discuss them with your colleagues. This screen includes suggested supports for students at the progressing level. You can find this chart on page 10 of the viewing guide. Many of these supports are similar to those at the emerging level. As students progress through this level and become more proficient in English, they may not need as many supports, or the types of supports they will need may change. Pause the video now to look over these suggestions and discuss them with your colleagues. This screen includes suggested supports for students at the nearly proficient level. You can find this chart on page 11 of the viewing guide. Students at this level may need fewer supports and different types of supports to access grade level content. To reiterate, these charts are suggestions only, and any of these supports may be appropriate for English learners at any level. These supports may also be appropriate for proficient students, particularly those who have been recently exited from English learner status. Pause the video now to look over these suggestions and discuss with your colleagues. This template, found on page 12 of the viewing guide, may help you to organize your students' levels and document supports. If time permits, pause the video to fill out the individual proficiency profile chart with the information of English learners in your class. Fill out the domain levels and proficiency level based on the assessment results you have, including the ALPA 21 summative. Refer back to the proficiency level chart on page 13 to determine if the students are emerging, progressing, or nearly proficient. For other student characteristics, consider things that may affect the types of supports the student may need in the classroom. Consider such things as the student's level of literacy in his or her native language, previous school experiences, student strengths, student's interests, and anything else you know about the student that may determine the best way to support him or her. Then discuss the supports that you think would help English learners in the class access math curriculum and standards based on the charts for emerging, progressing, and nearly proficient. Later, when you try out some supports, come back to this chart and analyze the effectiveness of these supports to determine if they are appropriate for that particular student. Another way to think about supporting English learners is to analyze your lessons for places where English learners will need support. You can use the charts on page 9 through 11 to add supports into your own math lessons to help English learners access the content. If it helps to look at some samples of this process, look at the Math Alignment resource document on the Title III website that includes sample math lessons on page 7 at different grade levels, which support English learners at different levels of proficiency. These samples were created during the alignment work by experts in both math and ELL. Thank you for taking the time to learn about supporting English learners. The purpose of this webinar was to provide math teachers with ideas for supporting English learners in the general education classroom. We hope that you've been able to get some ideas and have rich conversations with your colleagues about the best ways to assist English learners access grade level curriculum. That brings us to the end of the webinar. If you have more questions about supporting ELs, visit the Title III website for more information.